All right, this time I'm recording. All right, so I just recorded this and realized it did not record. So I am going to try this again. And if you hear whistling in the background of this video, it's my computer, not yours. It's my fan. It's a little bit too loud. Anyways, so I wrote my paper on U.S.-Iran relations through the 20th century, or most of the 20th century. Just kind of a basic overview. So a lot of this you guys have heard before. You guys are history majors. A lot of this is pretty familiar. And I know some of you guys, other people in the class, are doing presentations on Iran also. Hopefully I can contribute something unique. But anyways, so I think it's fair to say with U.S. perception of or policy towards the Middle East is that at best it lacks nuance and has a very short memory. But at worst, I think you can describe it as imperialistic and neo-colonialist. So we're going to kind of take a look at that and just a basic overview. So to look at review of past foreign relations, obviously the big thing to keep in mind with Iran is that it's Shia, and going back all the way to the time of Muhammad, the big issue with Shia Islam is, why is my slide changing on its own? The big thing with Shia Islam, going back to time of Muhammad, is, as you guys know, the question of legitimacy. What is legitimate authority? And so that's always a question in Shia Islam that's really in the 19th, 20th century has become a major theme. So we see to give us a little bit of background, Shia Safavid dynasty, who rejected the legitimacy of the Sunni Ottoman Empire. And then after the Safavids decline, the Qajar dynasty. And then in 1872, the Reuter concession, which the Reuter concession was basically a British banker. Okay, I'm going to make sure this is recording because, yes, it is recording. I just want to make sure, since I already went through this whole thing and it didn't record. All right. So Shia Safavid dynasty, said that Reuter concession was when a British banker negotiated with the Qajar king to basically complete foreign control of Persian roads, infrastructure, factories, resources. Were basically foreign control of all infrastructure in Persia. And then the 1891 tobacco concessions, where again, the growth, sale, and export of tobacco was handed over to to foreigners. There's a lot more I could say about foreign influence in Iran. Russia was very heavily involved. The big one is the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, oil being huge, still is huge. The creation of the oil company in 1901, and then the Constitutional Revolt in 1906, were creation of a parliament. And then the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 coming out of World War I, which you guys are familiar with the Sykes-Picot. I don't need to say a lot about it. One thing I do want to say, though, is at the time, Woodrow Wilson was the U.S. president. And, of course, in 1914, he had given his famous 14-point speech declaring principles of self-determination. So when he was invited to the talks of Sykes-Picot, how to carve up the Middle East, Wilson declined being in those talks, didn't want the U.S. involved. So seemingly staying true to his principles that he had articulated in his famous speech. So between World War I and World War II, the U.S. is not really very involved in the Middle East. It wasn't until Truman that the United States started becoming heavily involved in the Middle East. February 1945, which is only 2 months before the end of World War II in the European theater, where Stalin is trying to tighten his grip in Azerbaijan and even into Iran. And on March 2nd, the State Department had sent an ultimatum, a rebuke, as a gross violation of the agreement that they had negotiated. It wasn't really until 1946 that the Red Army retreated from Iran. But that ultimatum was on March 2nd, 1945. And on March 12th, President Truman made a speech before Congress where he made this statement here. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And so, what it seems like here is that Truman is pretty much staying true to the Wilsonian principles, that the United States is going to, what it sounds like, is going to respect sovereignty and to support the rights of free people. Um, but all of this is, again, in the context, the grand narrative of the Cold War. So through all of these U.S.-Iran relations for the United States, that's the grand narrative. Everything that happens in relation to Iran, Russia, the Soviet Union is the big picture. So this was the idea that, you know, the Soviet Union is not going to gain influence and bring the Middle East into its sphere of influence. Um, and so instead, what the United States is trying to do, so communist influence, is that United States is going to control this political space, become very involved in this political space. So you see the United States becoming increasingly involved in the context of the Cold War in the Middle East. And so if you're wondering if this picture is from the Rocky movies, yes, it is, and I don't apologize for that. But the major framework that the Cold War is always talked about in is that it's an idealistic struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. But was it really an idealistic struggle? Was it a pragmatic struggle of, you know, control of political space and influence? I think that's what we're really going to see. And so initially, you have the 1951, in Iran, they're observing a rising inequality between the British, who still own pretty much everything in Iran. And the parliament votes to nationalize the oil industry, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company becomes the National Iranian Oil Company. And then Mossadegh is declared the prime minister. And initially, Truman supports Mossadegh. You know, this is a democracy. This is what the United States is all about, making the world safe for democracy, as Wilson had famously said. Because they saw him as a good alternative to the Tudeh party, which was seen as sympathetic to communists, to socialists. And so the Truman administration is pretty supportive of the Mossadegh administration. And then it's, of course, the British are very upset. They're infuriated that Iran would nationalize oil from their control. And so the British start recruiting the United States to kind of take up the mantle that the British had laid down. And so Christopher Montague Woodhouse had visited Washington, D.C. in October of '52, and was kind of courting this idea of a coup in Iran, and talked to State Department officials. And what they had told him is that there's no way Truman is going to support a coup. But that President-elect Eisenhower probably would. So you just need to wait a little bit longer. And then Chancellor Harold Macmillan to Secretary of State John Dulles had said that the British had passed the torch to the United States after the Suez Crisis. The British action was the last grasp of declining power, urged the United States to think up some big imaginative plans for the Middle East. And so they were kind of planting the seeds. You know, the British were kind of the masterminds of the coup, but really needed the United States to be behind this, as, you know, as the new taking up the mantle of the British. And so this is the guy that the United States backs, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But even his name Pahlavi, that goes back to, you know, it's an old Persian name, you know, harkening back to pre-Islamic society. And so what he starts to do is to start this white revolution. So part of what made Mossadegh so popular was a was economic reform, socioeconomic reform. So Reza Shah starts taking these same types of initiatives with land reform, industrial growth, and just to modernize the country in basically in the image of Western democracy, to modernize and secularize the country. And at the same time, the United States is importing a ton of Western high-tech weapons, and U.S. military personnel is coming in and training Iranians how to use this military equipment. Um, but the Shah's regime was very oppressive, and basically dissent was not allowed, and there was a lot of human rights violations. And the Savak, which was basically a state police that would capture political prisoners, and they were very oppressive, especially the religious, would put them in prison. Um, and so a very oppressive regime that the United States had backed under the Eisenhower administration. And so Iranians, they pretty much see what's going on, that the United States is using the Shah as a puppet. Um, and so, you see Iran evolving from a democracy to an autocratic monarchy, kind of betraying, Wilson's idea of making the world safe for democracy. But you see in this picture here, the what's called the peacock throne, which is apparently something that the Persians used to have. And so he's using, deep, old Persian symbolism and language and so forth, trying to secularize the state and using symbolism that was pre-Islamic. So in 1971, he has this huge, massive parade in Persepolis, which, if you guys remember, very early on in the semester, we had a reading about Persepolis in Old Persia. And he's celebrating the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire. And so, he's creating this very secular Western state using a lot of this Persian imagery, and persecuting religion and putting them in prison, and all of this with the support of the United States. So what I think is important to note here is an evolution of U.S. foreign policy. So you see the Wilson administration, who seems to be staying true to his ideas of self-determination, and the Truman administration is becoming, the Cold War is beginning, and so while he's still willing to respect sovereignty, you move towards a foreign policy that's very focused on the Soviet Union, USSR focused. And then from Truman, who's focused on the Soviet Union, to Eisenhower, you see a huge step up, where the United States is becoming very deeply involved with regime change in 1953, and becoming involved in ways that really don't have anything to do with the Cold War at all. And so the United States has, from Wilson to Truman, Truman to Eisenhower, is becoming very deeply involved and betraying the very ideals that the Cold War is usually framed in. So I think that's important to note. In the Shah's autobiography, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. This is the only thing I have in this presentation from his autobiography. But he said this: I defy anybody to prove that the overturn of Mossadegh was not basically the work of the common people of my country, people whose hearts held a spark of the divine. And so the Shah insists that this coup was, the people wanted this. This was a grassroots kind of thing, and denies the involvement of foreign powers, that he was not a puppet. He's very insistent on that. But Iranians, they see through that. They know better than that. So international relations students should be pretty familiar with modernization theory, but this was really what U.S. foreign policy was based on, which was articulated by Max Weber. But this was what the United States strategy was during the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s, and would last 1970s and 80s is when it would really start to falter. But the basic thesis is to take traditional states, whatever that means exactly, and to create modern secular states in the image of the West. The idea of this strategy is, if you can modernize and secularize these states, that you will be bringing these non-aligned states into the sphere of influence of the United States rather than the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So Henry Kissinger, who would eventually become Secretary of State under Nixon, he had said personal dictatorship may be necessary for imposing social economic modernization from above. And so, talking about dictatorships, it's really betraying I've said this like 3 times already, betraying the ideals of democracy that the Cold War is usually framed in order to create what this would really become kind of the genesis of U.S. foreign policy that opts for stability over self-determination by supporting dictators. Then Walt Rostow, who worked for Kissinger, he had he had characterized communism as a kind of disease which can befall a traditional society if it fails to get on with the job of modernization. So this was the whole framework, the idea that in order for the United States to win the Cold War, needed to bring these countries into the sphere of influence of the United States rather than the Communist Union. And so, the people, the Iranian people, they saw it. You see in the sign there, Shah is the U.S. puppet, down with the Shah. So they recognize what's going on. So I'm going to spend most of the rest of my presentation on this guy. He's so fascinating. Actually, one thing I forgot to say back here, that Jimmy Carter in the 80s had created a rapid response force. The idea was to bring a U.S. military presence kind of just over the horizon, just out of sight, that could, be in Iran or anywhere else in the Middle East in a moment's notice. So you kind of see, in my mind, I kind of think of it as a Monroe Doctrine, a signal to the Soviet Union. This is not your sphere of influence. This is our sphere of influence. But I'm going to spend most of the rest of my presentation on this guy because he's so fascinating. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini is such a fascinating character. I really enjoyed researching this guy. But Khomeini sees all of this that's going on with the attempted secularization of the Iranian state, and he's seeing the oppression of religion and political prisoners. And he becomes the voice of the oppressed in Iran, and is really tapping into this Shia tradition that we already talked about in the first slide about illegitimate authority. Iran is still recovering from colonialism, and they see this as neocolonialism, is the way they see this. And so, he pejoratively references the Shah and his peacock throne, and kind of making fun of him. And then this idea, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce it, the faqih, which we've talked about in class before, I know, idea of Islamic jurisprudence, and the creation of jurists. And some of the scholars that I researched talk about how in Shiism that is considered a heterodoxical belief, the idea of having religious elites. But what this demonstrates is, what I think this demonstrates in Khomeini's revolution is the ability to demonstrate the adaptability of political Islam. And so in January and February of 1979, the Islamic Revolution is underway. And Khomeini gives this anti-American speech, which I find interesting. He says, America is the #1 enemy of the deprived and oppressed people of the world. It exploits the oppressed people of the world by means of the large-scale propaganda campaigns that are coordinated for it by international Zionism. I never get to Zionism in my paper, unfortunately, because that's such a huge part of this whole story. I never got to that, unfortunately. Anyways, by means of its hidden and treacherous agents, it sucks the blood of the defenseless people as if it is alone. Together with its satellites, had the right to live in this world. Iran has tried to sever all its relations with this great Satan. So in the Islamic Revolution, they see that the United States is behind all of this. They're not buying the Shah's rhetoric that he's not a puppet. Um, Khomeini, he sees what's going on. He understands. Um, and so this is the same slide I saw earlier, but just to compare it with Truman's statement again, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. So what I see happening here is the United States has basically become the very boogeyman that they set out to destroy at the beginning of the Cold War. Remember, when he made the statement, he had in mind the Soviet Union. Um, but the United States came to fill that position instead, what it seems. So to go back to Khomeini, they in Iran's new constitution after 1979, they had included this statement: absolute sovereignty over the world and man belongs to Allah, and it is He who has made man master of his own social identity. No man can deprive man of this divine right, nor subordinate it to vested interest of a particular individual or group. So, basically what's happened is Iran went from a secular state to an explicitly Islamic state in Iran's constitution. So what's really at the core of the Islamic Revolution is it's a reactionary propensity that's hinged on the desire to reorganize society in the directives of the Islamic faith. I think that's what's happening here. And we talked about or read about earlier in the semester the John Vall reading about uh, instead of creating a secular state, to Islamize modernity, take modernity, but in Islamic modernity, I think is what is happening here. And so Khomeini takes on the title of Imam, and this is significant because it has the word Imam has a different meaning in Sunni Islam than it does in Shia Islam. In Sunni Islam, it just means someone who leads in prayer at the mosque. But in Shia Islam, it means something very different as a reference to the 12th Imam. But by using this word Imam, he's laying claim to the very lineage of Muhammad, a different kind of an absolute legitimacy as the 12th Imam, who's infallible, sinless, divinely chosen. But in Shia Islam, they believe that through all of human history, I suppose since Muhammad, I guess, I don't know, that there has always been an imam that is living on one of these 12 imams that is alive on earth. And so the 12th imam has been, on earth for hundreds of years, I suppose. And so he's using deeply messianic language in calling himself imam. And so there's this really fascinating account here. On one occasion, a parliamentary deputy asked him, Khomeini, if he was the promised Mahdi. Mahdi is just another reference to the 12th Imam. If he was the promised Mahdi, Khomeini did not answer. Fearing that Khomeini had not heard, the MP repeated the question. Khomeini still did not answer, astutely neither claiming nor denying that he was the 12th Imam. And so he's basically implicitly, you could almost say explicitly, just by using the word, that he is the 12th Imam. And so I think what he's doing is he's representing himself in a way that to oppose his revolution is to oppose Islam itself, at least if you're a Shia. And he's able to create a cultic following and a populist movement that you cannot oppose him without opposing Islam. And so he's kind of juxtaposing, the ultimate legitimization in Islam to the Shah, who's a puppet. And so for Americans, the Islamic Revolution is very well known because of the hostages that were taken from the embassy that was stormed. And so for Iranians, the kind of the backdrop of all U.S.-Iran relations is the 1953 coup, that the United States, we pulled the trigger first, that is the background for them. But like I said in the very beginning, that Americans tend to have a pretty short memory. And for Americans, the backdrop of U.S.-Iran relations is this grievance of uh, holding American hostages and storming the embassy. Um, and so I was just talking to my sister-in-law the other day about the United States overthrowing democracies, and she's just like, "What in the world is that all about? I never heard about that." But yeah, most Americans have no idea about 1953. We're history majors. Hopefully, I think we all know about this kind of stuff. Pretty familiar with this. Um, but of course, this was a humiliating instance for President Carter, unable to negotiate the release of the hostages. To close out my presentation, uh, so Iran today in the 21st century, uh, Mohammad Khatami was president of Iran from 1997 to 2005 and was seen as a reformer in Iran. And he had said this, that the goal of reformers was to introduce to the world the model of religious democracy, to find a balance between liberalism and an Islamic system. So, what I think, to kind of knock on my own field of study, international relations, I think what we see is an inability for decision makers, for policymakers, to be able to see international relations in socio-religious terms rather than in terms of only seeing in terms of nation states rather than socio-religious terms. Um, and has led to a lack of nuanced understanding of Iran and the role that Islam plays in their identity. And so when I look at U.S. foreign policy towards Iran today, taking a very bellicose tone with maximum pressure campaign, how I think we can do better in trying to understand and implement more effective policy towards Iran. Um, and so um, this picture you see here is a painting that's on the wall outside of where the U.S. Embassy used to be. You see paintings like that all over Iran, anti-American murals. Um, Anyways, that's what I have. One last comment. The 1953 coup. It wasn't until 2017 that the CIA officially acknowledged its role. So I guess it's a baby step, I guess, in the right direction. Um, but it took us that long to acknowledge our role, and um, that's what I have for my presentation. So hopefully you guys learned something you didn't know. Maybe there you have it.